Well, hello, friends. Welcome to the channel. My name is Sean, and this is the Berean Way, a channel where we strive to be as the Bereans, searching the Scriptures daily in pursuit of biblical truth. So welcome to the channel, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us for another teaching here on the Berean Way. And if you haven't already, let me just encourage you, go and check out some of the other videos that we have here on the channel. We have several videos already uploaded to the channel and a couple of playlists, so go check those out. Now, if you would like to support the channel, one of the simplest and easiest ways to do that is like the videos, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon so that you get notified of future videos, and share our content. That really is just a simple, easy way to help support the channel. And let me just say that we certainly do appreciate any and all support that you give in helping us with the channel. Now, before we get started with today's teaching, let me just encourage you to go and watch our last three videos, The Delusion of Dispensationalism, Part 1, 2, and 3. Those three videos in this series provide some background information for what we're going to be discussing in today's video. Viewing those earlier videos will help establish context and understanding for the material that's going to be presented here today. Now, in the first video, we started with an in-depth overview of what dispensationalism is. We briefly reviewed its core tenets, and we also did a fairly detailed historical examination, which we believe is important to understanding the origin and the history of this doctrine. Now, in the second teaching, we critique dispensationalism's core tenet of a rigid dichotomy between Israel as an earthly people with exclusive literal fulfillment of Abrahamic, Davidic, and New Covenant promises, and the church as a heavenly, primarily Gentile parentheses, raptured in a pre-tribulation rapture, a view originating with Darby and Schofield in the 19th century and absent in early church history. Scripture instead portrays one unified, set-apart assembly, kahal in the Hebrew, or ecclesia in the Greek, from Genesis onward, always incorporating Gentiles with believers, Jew and Gentile, as Abraham's heirs, one body, one flock, and grafted into one olive tree. True Israel is defined by faith with the fullness of the Gentiles, as Paul refers to in Romans 11, fulfilling Ephraim's scattering among the nations, regathered in Messiah as lost sheep, contradicting dispensational dualism. In our previous teaching, the third in our series on the delusion of dispensationalism, we dismantled the dispensational claim that law and grace are mutually exclusive, with grace supposedly replacing the Torah in the current age, rendering Yahweh's commandments obsolete. Now, Scripture reveals law and grace as complementary. Torah, Yahweh's eternal instructions, defines righteousness and reveals sin, while grace forgives and empowers obedience, writing the Torah on our hearts, according to Jeremiah 31. Yeshua affirmed he came to fulfill, not to abolish the Torah, according to Matthew 5, verses 17 through 19. Tying love for Yahweh to keeping his commandments in John 14, apostles like the Apostle Paul upheld Torah's role post-salvation, according to Romans 3:31 and Ephesians 2:8 through 10, and early Jewish believers remained zealous for the Torah, according to Acts 21. Prophets foresee the Messiah teaching Torah globally in the millennial kingdom, according to Isaiah 2 and Micah 4, proving its enduring harmony with grace. And today, we continue exposing dispensational errors, building on this foundation to explore further biblical truths. So again, if you haven't yet, go watch those videos before you view this one. Now, in today's teaching, we're continuing our series on the delusion of dispensationalism, with this video being the fourth and final teaching in the series. And I just want to continue to clarify and state moving forward, as we have done in the previous videos, that there are variations and nuances of this doctrine. So, not everyone who holds to the doctrine of dispensationalism will necessarily believe every aspect or nuance of it as we will present it here today. It should also be noted that since its inception, there have been some changes that have taken place concerning this doctrine. So there are some differences between what is known as classic dispensationalism in its original form and structure and progressive dispensationalism, which is a bit more nuanced from the original. And it's very likely that progressive dispensationalism is what most listening to this teaching would be more familiar with, since it is the more common form of our day. Now today, with our fourth and final video in the series, The Delusion of Dispensationalism, we're diving into another contested and debated topic in eschatology, the Millennium and the return of the Messiah. Our teaching, subtitled Why Historic Premillennialism Triumphs Over Dispensationalism, will contrast these two premillennial views, affirming historic premillennialism as the more biblically grounded position, using Revelation 20 verses 1 through 10 as our base text. We'll explore histories, definitions, scriptural foundations, and some key figures. And I want to also point out, as some will surely say, that I didn't cover certain aspects of this topic, that we can only cover so much of a particular topic in any given video. So this video will not be comprehensive in covering this topic. The goal is to provide enough information on the topic to provoke you, the listener, to further study on your own, being a noble Berean. Eschatology, the study of end times, has fascinated believers for centuries. Both historic and dispensational premillennialism affirm the literal 1,000-year reign of Messiah after his return as depicted in Revelation chapter 20. Yet they differ profoundly in interpretation, timing, and implications for Israel and the church. Historic premillennialism, rooted in early church teachings, sees continuity in Elohim's plan with the church enduring tribulation before Messiah's return. Dispensationalism, a 19th century innovation, introduces sharp divisions and a pre-tribulation rapture. Now, we're going to look at each view. We're going to trace some of the history, then look at what Scripture has to say. So let's begin with our base text found in Revelation chapter 20, beginning with verse 1. Revelation 20, verse 1. And I saw a messenger coming down from the heaven, having the key to the pit of the deep and a great chain in his hand. And he seized the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he threw him into the pit of the deep, and shut him up, and set a seal on him, so that he should lead the nations no more astray until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he has to be released for a little season. And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. And the lives of those who had been beheaded because of the witness they bore to Yeshua and because of the word of Elohim, and who did not worship the beast, nor his image, and did not receive his mark upon their foreheads or upon their hands, and they lived and reigned with Messiah for 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and set apart is the one having part in the first resurrection. The second death possesses no authority over these, but they shall be priests of Elohim and of Messiah, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years have ended, Satan shall be released from his prison, and he shall go out and lead the nations astray, which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. And they came up over the breadth of the earth, and surrounded the camp of the set-apart ones and the beloved city, and fire came down from Elohim out of the heaven and consumed them. And the devil who led them astray was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet are, and they shall be tortured day and night forever and ever. Now, this passage paints a vivid picture of the millennial reign and the binding of Satan and the ultimate judgment. But what does it mean? Does it describe a future literal 1,000-year earthly kingdom with distinct dispensations for Israel and the church, or something a bit more integrated with Yahweh's overall unified redemptive plan? Now, let's move into the text here. Revelation 20 is the cornerstone text of premillennial eschatology, yet its interpretation, it hinges on how we read the 1,000 years or the millennium. The Revelation, which was written by John around 95 to 96 AD during Roman persecution under the rule of Domitian, it draws from prophetic imagery from the Hebrew writings like the beast of Daniel 7 and the new creation from Isaiah chapters 65 and 66 to encourage suffering believers. Now, culturally, first century Israelites and early followers of Messiah expected Yahweh's kingdom to fulfill promises to Israel, but through Messiah's victory, not through political restoration alone. Now, historically, premillennialism traces to the early church fathers like Papias, who lived between 60 and 130 AD, who saw a literal millennium as Yahweh's reward for faithfulness, contrasting later amillennial views from Augustine, who lived between AD 354 to 430, who spiritualized it amid Constantine's Christianized empire, where church and state were in tandem with Constantine leading the way. Now, today, we're examining why historic premillennialism, affirming a future literal millennium as the culmination of Yahweh's covenant promises, aligns more faithfully with Scripture than dispensational premillennialism, which emerged in the 19th century via John Nelson Darby and the Plymouth Brethren, influenced by a rigid legalism and a restored Jewish temple focus amid rising Zionism. Now, our goal today is to test both against the Scripture, from the Hebrew writings to the apostolic writings, showing historic premillennialism's continuity in Yahweh's plan for one redeemed people, Jew and Gentile, grafted into Israel, as we saw in the second video in this series and as found in Romans chapter 11 by Paul. Now, before we get started, it should be noted that there's going to be some overlap with the content presented in this video with that of the content presented in the previous videos in order to be able to accurately show the difference between the two views. So let's begin by defining historic premillennialism. Now, historic premillennialism, also called classic premillennialism, posits Messiah's return before the millennium with believers facing tribulation. It emphasizes unity between Israel and the church, with Gentiles grafted into Yahweh's people. Now, not that we need the witness of the early church fathers, but this view was prominent among many of them, like Papias, who lived between 60 to 130 AD and was a disciple of John, and Justin Martyr, who lived between 100 to 165 AD, and Irenaeus, who lived between 130 to 202 AD, and Hippolytus, who lived between 170 to 235 AD. Now, adaptations include a balanced hermeneutic, recognizing symbolism and prophecy while affirming a literal millennium. So now let's define dispensational premillennialism. Now, dispensational premillennialism divides history into dispensations with a strict separation between Israel and the church. It features a pre-tribulation rapture, a 7-year tribulation, a Jewish-focused millennium. It was originated by John Nelson Darby, who lived between 1800 and 1882 and was the founder of the Plymouth Brethren in the 1830s. It was popularized by Cyrus Schofield's Reference Bible, printed in 1909, and as already noted, this doctrine has been adapted into what is known as progressive dispensationalism, somewhat softening this separation. Now, modern proponents of progressive dispensationalism would include some names you're familiar with, such as Tim LaHaye with his Left Behind series, and the likes of, maybe for some of us older folks, Hal Lindsey and the late great Planet Earth, and John Walvoord, and many others. But let's begin by examining this doctrine, starting with the unity of Yahweh's people. Now, this section, it emphasizes the biblical theme of a single, unified people of Yahweh across history, contrasting it with dispensationalism's tendency to create false divisions between Israel and the church. The historic view sees Yahweh's redemptive plan as one continuous storyline from Genesis to Revelation, where promises to Israel find their fulfillment in the Messiah and is extended to all believers. Dispensationalism, particularly in its classic form, posits distinct dispensations or eras where Yahweh deals differently with Israel as a national ethnic entity and the church as a separate, primarily Gentile body. Now, this division is seen as artificial because it overlooks the portrayal of unity in Messiah as found in the apostolic writings, where ethnic and national barriers are transcended. The overall scriptural narrative supports a full redemption, not divided plans and promises, highlighting Yahweh's faithfulness to his covenant through a unified people. Now, the historic view sees one redemptive plan, while dispensationalism divides Israel and the church artificially. Now, expanding on this, the historic view interprets Scripture through the lens of progressive revelation, where promises from the Hebrew writings are fulfilled in the apostolic era, including Gentiles, not just ethnic Israel. For instance, the Abrahamic covenant, as found in Genesis 12, promises blessings to all nations, which Galatians 3 expands to include Gentiles in Messiah. Now, dispensationalism's division often stems from a hyper-literal hermeneutic that insists on separating destinies, Israel inheriting an earthly kingdom and the church a heavenly one. Now, this is critiqued as artificial because it ignores passages like Ephesians 2:11 through 22, where Gentiles are made fellow citizens with Israel in one household of Elohim, breaking down that dividing wall of hostility. The unity is not a replacement, but an inclusion, forming one body under the new covenant as found in Jeremiah 31 and fulfilled in Hebrews 8. Now, dispensational premillennialism, it fails to understand the teachings of Paul in Romans 11 and really the overall theme of Scripture of the Gentiles being grafted into the olive tree of Israel. So let's look at this grafting into Israel's olive tree. Now, this metaphor of grafting, it shows how it directly challenges dispensationalism's separation. The olive tree represents Israel's covenantal heritage, with the root symbolizing Yahweh's faithfulness. Gentiles, as wild branches, are incorporated not as a new tree, but into the existing one, emphasizing continuity over divisions. And dispensationalism's separation, it contradicts the unity of the apostolic writings, which repeatedly affirms unity, such as found in Ephesians chapter 4. Where we read in Ephesians 4:4, one body and one spirit, as you also were called in one expectation of your calling, one master, one belief, one immersion or baptism, one Elohim and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. We also read in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 11, where Paul says, there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, foreigner, Scythian, slave, free, but Messiah is all and in all. And so Paul is clearly showing no division. Dispensationalism's insistence on two separate peoples with distinct plans contradicts this by positing a future where Israel alone inherits the promises while the church is raptured away. Now, this separation, it ignores the grafting's implication. Gentiles don't replace Israel, but join Israel, forming a unified Israel of Elohim as found in Galatians 6:16. Now, let's transition here and let's look at Romans chapter 11, beginning with verse 17, where Paul says, and if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, have been grafted in among them, and become a share of the root and fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches, and if you boast, remember, you do not bear the root, but the root bears you. You shall say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. True, by unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by belief. Do not be arrogant, but fear. For if Elohim did not spare the natural branches, he might not spare you either. See then the kindness and sharpness of Elohim. on those who fell sharpness, but kindness toward you, provided you remain in his kindness. Otherwise, you also shall be cut off. And they also, if they do not remain in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for Elohim is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these who are the natural branches be grafted in to their own olive tree? Now, in this passage, Paul addresses Gentile believers in Rome, warning against arrogance. The natural branches are unbelieving Jews broken off due to unbelief in verse 20, while Gentiles are grafted in by faith in verse 17. The root, symbolizing Abrahamic promises or Yahweh's election, supports all branches, showing no separate destiny according to verse 18. Now, Yahweh's severity, as seen in verse 22, and ability to regraft the Jews in verse 22 highlight conditional inclusion based on faith, not just ethnicity. Now, the contrary to nature grafting, as found in verse 24, emphasizes unity. Wild or Gentile branches thrive on the cultivated or the Israel tree, if you will. And this metaphor, it refutes any notion of two peoples. Instead, there's one tree, one people, sustained by the same root. And this grafting, it shows continuity between Israel and Gentile believers, not separation. And friend, this clearly refutes dispensationalism's two peoples with two destinies and two separate sets of promises. Now, if you want to learn more about this, go watch the second video in this series where we covered this in much more detail. Now, let's move on and let's look at the promises fulfilled and applied to all believers. Now, here the focus shifts to how promises from the Hebrew writings and the prophecies extend to all set-apart believers, not just ethnic Israel, through covenant with Messiah. This fulfillment, it's inclusive, applying in the millennium and eternity. The promises found in the Hebrew writings apply to all believers in the millennium. The Hebrew Scriptures, or what most would call the Old Testament, contain covenants like the Davidic covenant found in 2 Samuel 7, and the New Covenant is found in Jeremiah 31, which dispensationalism reserves for Israel. However, the apostolic writings applies them to all set-apart believers. The Davidic throne is fulfilled in Yeshua's resurrection, as seen in Acts chapter 2, and the New Covenant in his blood, as found in Luke 22. In the millennium, these bless all the set-apart ones, all believers of Yahweh, as Revelation 21 and 22 depicts a renewed creation for the unified set-apart ones of Yahweh. Now let's look at Galatians 3:28, where we read, "There is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, for you are all one in Messiah Yeshua. And if you belong to Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise." Now, friend, Paul argues that in the Messiah, social and ethnic distinctions really dissolve. No Jew, no Greek, as found in verse 28, and it creates unity. Belonging to Messiah makes one Abraham's seed, according to verse 29, inheriting the promises of Abraham. We enter into covenant by faith, not just by our keeping of the law, extending to Gentiles, okay? Our obedience to the law and commandments is something that comes as a result of our faith and entering into covenant. And it refutes separation by making all of the set-apart believers co-heirs, fulfilling the promise to bless all nations through Abraham. Now, the grafting from Romans 11, it aligns with becoming Abraham's seed, inheriting covenants that align with Isaiah's prophecies, which point to Messiah, including Gentiles, showing inclusive fulfillment. Let's look at Isaiah 42 and verse 6, where we read, "I, Yahweh, have called you in righteousness, and I strengthen your hand and guard you, and give you for a covenant to a people, for a light to the nations." Now, this verse It addresses the servant, often interpreted as the Messiah, whom Yahweh calls in righteousness and appoints as a covenant to a people. And notice this, a light to the nations or Gentiles. And so here, nations, it explicitly refers to Gentiles, indicating that the servant's role establishes a new, or probably more proper, a renewed covenant that illuminates and includes outsiders, strangers, Gentiles, if you will. And so it promises Gentiles access to Yahweh's righteousness and guardianship, transforming the covenant from an exclusive Israelite inheritance into one that has been opened to the Gentiles. Now let's look at Isaiah 49 and verse 6, where we read, "And he says, shall it be a small matter for you to be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to bring back the preserved ones of Israel? And I shall give you as a light to the nations," or Gentiles, "to be my deliverer to the ends of the earth." Now, building on the servant's mission, Yahweh declares he will not only restore the tribes of Jacob and the preserved ones of Israel, but the servant will be a light to the nations and bring Yahweh's deliverance to the ends of the earth. Now, this expands the promise of salvation, including Gentiles as recipients of Yahweh's deliverance. And so this verse, it underscores that Israel's restoration serves as a catalyst for broader inclusion, fulfilling Abrahamic prophecies of being a blessing to all nations, as we find in Genesis chapter 12. Let's look at Isaiah 56 and verse 6, where we read, "Also the sons of the foreigner who join themselves to Yahweh to serve him and to love the name of Yahweh, to be his servants and to guard the Sabbath," notice that one, "and not profane it, and are holding on to my covenant, them I shall bring to my set-apart mountain, and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. Their ascending offerings and their slaughterings are accepted on my slaughter place, for my house is called a house of prayer for all the peoples." Now, this passage directly invites sons of the foreigners, or in other words, Gentiles, who align with Yahweh, serving him, loving his name, guarding his Sabbath, which we've been told is done away with, and holding to his covenant, to participate in these sacred privileges, in this sacred times of worship. Yahweh promises to bring them to his set-apart mountain, or Zion, we might say, and grant joy in his house of prayer and accept their offerings. And so the declaration that his house will be a house of prayer for all peoples affirms inclusive worship, where Gentiles share in the covenantal blessings like temple access and worship, provided they commit to Yahweh's ways. Now, let's shift our focus just a bit, and let's look at the nature of the millennium. Now, the millennium, it's described as a unified post-tribulation reign on a renewed earth where Yeshua rules over all nations. Now, this contrasts with dispensationalism's view of a premillennial post-rapture Jewish kingdom focused on Israel, with the church being absent. The millennium is a unified reign on a renewed earth post-tribulation versus a Jewish kingdom post-rapture. Now, we can clearly see during this time that Satan is bound and the saints reign. Let's go back to Revelation 20 and look at verse 1. "And I saw a messenger coming down from the heaven, having the key to the pit of the deep and a great chain in his hand. And he seized the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he threw him into the pit of the deep and shut him up and set a seal on him so that he should lead the nations no more astray until the 1,000 years were ended. And after that, he has to be released for a little while." Now, Revelation 20 depicts Satan as bound, and he remains that way for 1,000 years before he is released. Now, those would hold to a view such as amillennialism. They would see the millennium as the time between the first and second coming of Messiah, meaning they would see him as already bound. But let's ask the question here, Do you think he's already bound and unable to deceive the nations, as Revelation 20 states? Now, I would argue that he's deceiving all nations at the moment and will continue until he is actually bound. Now, Revelation 20 depicts believers from the tribulation reigning, implying that believers are present during the tribulation period. Now, the saints, it includes those beheaded for refusing the beast's mark, showing endurance through the trials, not removal before in a supposed secret pre-trib rapture. Now, Revelation 20 and verse 4, let's read here. And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them, and the lives of those who had been beheaded because of the witness they bore to Yeshua, and because of the word of Elohim, and who did not worship the beast nor his image, and did not receive his mark upon their foreheads or upon their hands. And they lived and reigned with Messiah for 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. And pay attention, this is the first resurrection. Blessed and set apart is the one having part in the first resurrection. The second death possesses no authority over these, but they shall be priests of Elohim and of Messiah, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. So clearly, we see that a pre-trib rapture where the saints are supposedly resurrected and living believers are raptured with them is impossible according to Revelation 20, verses 4 through 6. These are clearly believers who endured or were martyred in the tribulation, not raptured out 7 years earlier with them being a part of the first resurrection. We also see thrones and judgments in verse 4, which reflects back to Daniel chapter 7, where we read in Daniel 7 and verse 22, until the Ancient of Days came, and right ruling was given to the set-apart ones of the Most High, and the time came, and the set-apart ones took possession of the reign. Now, the beheaded saints are clearly tribulation martyrs, as seen in Revelation 13, reigning with Messiah. The first resurrection, as we've seen in verses 5 and 6 of Revelation 20, includes all believers, given victory over the second death, according to Revelation 20, verse 14, making them priests in a unified reign, making it impossible for a pre-tribulation rapture to have happened. So let's continue, and let's look at a post-battle kingdom for all nations. Now, the kingdom follows a cosmic battle here, blessing all nations under Yahweh's sovereignty or his kingship and his rule. The Hebrew writings align with a post-trib return. Now, prophets like Zechariah, they depict Messiah's return after tribulation, after this tribulation-like time or this tribulation-like distress, establishing a global kingdom. So let's look at Zechariah chapter 14, verse 1, where we read, see, a day shall come for Yahweh, and your spoil shall be divided in your midst. And I shall gather all the Gentiles to battle against Jerusalem, and the city shall be taken, the houses plundered, and the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into exile, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. And Yahweh shall go forth, and he shall fight against those Gentiles as he fights in the day of battle. And in that day his feet shall stand upon the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west, and a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall move toward the north, and half of it toward the south. And you shall flee to the valley of my mountain, for the valley of the mountains reaches to Otzel. And you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, sovereign of Judah, or king of Judah, and Yahweh my Elohim shall come, all the set-apart ones with you. And in that day it shall be, there is no light, it is dark. And it shall be one day which is known to Yahweh, neither day nor night, but at evening time there shall be light. And in that day it shall be that living waters flow from Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea, and half of them toward the western sea, in summer as well as winter, and Yahweh shall be sovereign or king over all the earth. In that day there shall be one Yahweh, and his name one. Now, the day of Yahweh, it involves nations attacking Jerusalem, according to verses 1 and 2 that we just read, followed by Yahweh's intervention through his anointed Messiah, as seen in verse 3. Now, the Messiah's feet standing on the Mount of Olives, as we just read in verse 4, it fulfills Yahweh's promise as paralleled in Acts chapter 1 and 11, where he promises to return in the same manner he left. And the cosmic signs, as seen in verses 6 and 7, and living waters in verse 8, sort of reminiscent of Ezekiel 47 possibly, they symbolize the renewal of a creation under Yahweh's Torah. Yahweh's universal sovereignty or his kingship, his rulership, as the one true Elohim, as seen in verse 9, extends to all nations, calling them to obedience to his commandments, not limited to Israel alone. Yahweh's reign, it blesses all set-apart believers, and later verses in Zechariah 14, such as verses 16 through 21, show surviving nations worshiping, extending the blessings globally. So let's go to Zechariah 14, and let's read beginning at verse 16, where it says, "And it shall be that all who are left from the nations which came up against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year, bow themselves to the sovereign Yahweh of hosts, and to celebrate the festival of Sukkot." Now pay attention here. "And it shall be that if any one of the clans of the earth does not come up to Jerusalem to bow himself to the sovereign Yahweh of hosts, on them there is to be no rain. And if the clan of Egypt does not come up and enter in, then there is no rain. On them is the plague which Yahweh plagues the nations who do not come up to celebrate the festival of Sukkot. This is the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of the nations that do not come up to celebrate the festival of Sukkot." Verse 20, "In that day, set apart to Yahweh, shall be engraved on the bells of the horses, and the pots in the house of Yahweh shall be like the bowls before the slaughter place, and every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be set apart to Yahweh of hosts, and all those who slaughter shall come and take them and cook in them, and there shall no longer be a merchant in the house of Yahweh of hosts in that day." Now, we can see from these verses that we have all nations, Gentiles included, coming before Yahweh to worship and also receiving blessing from Yahweh. Now, there's a lot that could be said about these verses, but we just don't have the time to cover in this video. But notice that all nations come to Jerusalem and observe the feast of Sukkot. You know, that feast that we've been taught doesn't apply to us because it's Jewish. Now, ask yourself, does it really make sense that the feasts of Yahweh were kept all those years only to be set aside during the supposed dispensation of grace or the age of grace to return during the millennial kingdom? I don't think so, but I'm going to let you answer that one and let you ponder on that one. So let's move on, and let's look at the resurrection and the rapture timing here. Now, the rapture and the resurrection occurs post-tribulation at Messiah's visible return, not at a secret pre-trib event. Now, Scripture ties the rapture to the last trumpet after tribulation, aligning with one return according to 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 through 17, and with Matthew 24, verse 31. So let's look at the last trumpet resurrection. Now, this links resurrection to the final trumpet post-tribulation. The trumpet signals gathering after distress, not before. Now let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, beginning with verse 50, where Paul talks about this last trump. And this is what he says, "And this I say, brothers, that flesh and blood is unable to inherit the reign or the kingdom of Elohim, neither does corruption inherit incorruption. See, I speak a secret to you. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. For this corruptible has to put on incorruption, and this mortal to put on immortality. And when this corruptible has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall come to be the word that has been written, death is swallowed up in overcoming. Now, the mystery or the secret that Paul is speaking of is the resurrection, not a pre-trib rapture as many people claim. Flesh cannot inherit the kingdom according to verse 50, as Paul says. So transformation must occur and take place, as we see in verse 51. And we have to be changed or resurrected, if you will. When does this happen? Well, Paul tells us that at the last trumpet in verse 52, the dead rise incorruptible, receiving the fullness of their salvation and a resurrected body. Now, Paul says that this fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah 25:8 in verse 54 there, where death is swallowed up in overcoming. So let's look at Isaiah 25 and verse 8, where we read, "He shall swallow up death forever. And the Master Yahweh shall wipe away tears from all faces and take away the reproach of his people from all the earth, for Yahweh has spoken." So this trumpet is clearly post-trib. So let's move on and let's look at Revelation chapter 11, verses 15 through 18, where we read, "And the seventh messenger sounded, and there came loud voices in the heavens saying, The reign of this world has become the reign of our Master and of his Messiah, and he shall reign forever and ever. And the 24 elders sitting before Elohim on their thrones fell on their faces and worshipped Elohim, saying, We give you thanks, O Yahweh El Shaddai, the one who is and who was and who is coming. Because you have taken your great power and reigned, and the nations were enraged, and your wrath has come, and the time of the dead to be judged, and to give the reward to your servants, the prophets, and to the set-apart ones, and to those who fear your name, small and great, and to destroy those who destroy the earth." Now notice in verse 15, the seventh angel sounds the seventh trumpet, and then in verse 18, the dead are judged, specifically those who are his servants, prophets, if you will, and the set-apart ones, and those who fear his name. Now, it stands to reason that if there are rewards being given, there would also be a resurrection, which happens at the seventh trumpet. Now, even Yeshua himself ties the seventh trumpet, or the trumpet, to the gathering of his people in Matthew 24. So let's look at Matthew 24, verses 29 and following. "And immediately after the distress of those days, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give its light, and the stars shall fall from the heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Adam, or the Son of Man, shall appear in the heavens, and then all the tribes of the earth shall mourn, and they shall see the Son of Adam, or the Son of Man, coming on the clouds of heaven with power and much esteem," or great glory, some translations would say. "And he shall send his messengers with the great sound of a trumpet." Here's the trumpet right here. "And they shall gather together his chosen ones from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other." So here, after tribulation's celestial events, as recorded here in verse 29, and you can also find that in Joel 2 and 31, the Son of Man appears visibly here in verse 30. The trumpet gathers the elect when it sounds in verse 31, matching 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16, as well as Revelation. So, friend, it's clearly post-trib. So let's move on now, and let's look at how the resurrection happens after this time of distress. So, resurrection, it follows this unprecedented time of distress or tribulation, encouraging endurance in Yah's people. So believers are delivered after trials, not exempted. So let's look at Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1, where we read, "Now at that time Michael shall stand up, the great head who is standing over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of distress, such as never was since there was a nation until that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, every one who is found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth wake up, some to everlasting life, and some to reproaches, everlasting abhorrence. And those who have insight shall shine like the brightness of the expanse, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." And so Michael's rise here, it precedes the time of great distress here, coinciding with Matthew 24 and verse 21. So delivery and resurrection follow here in verse 2 of Daniel 12, with the righteous shining eternally in verse 3, implying, friend, a post-tribulation rapture. Now let's look at the prophetic fulfillment and symbolism found here. Prophecy is interpreted comprehensive, balancing literal and symbolic elements versus dispensationalism's rigid literalism. Now, while some prophecies are literal, such as the Messiah's birth in Bethlehem, others use symbolism, for example, the beast in Daniel. And so rigid literalism, it misses some of the typological fulfillments. So let's look at the signs before the day of Yahweh here, because signs precede the day of Yahweh, linking to a post-trib return. Joel's signs aligns with Matthew 24 and Revelation 6. So let's look at Joel chapter 2, beginning at verse 30, where we read, "And I shall give signs in the heavens and up on the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun is turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of Yahweh. And it shall be that everyone who calls on the name of Yahweh shall be delivered. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be an escape, as Yahweh has said, and among the survivors whom Yahweh calls." And so here we see this cosmic disturbance, or these cosmic signs in verses 30 and 31 signal the day of Yahweh. And this again parallels what Yeshua said in Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31, where they take place after the tribulation. Again, friend, making it post-trib. And so we also see deliverance for those who call on his name in verse 22, which is quoted also in Acts chapter 2 and verse 21. So believers, they have an escape route, if you will, but not a pre-trib rapture, but in Zion for survivors, implying endurance through signs, again, making it post-trib. And so we also see the believers in the tribulation. Scripture shows the church, if you will, or Yahweh's set-apart ones, protected in, not removed from the tribulation. Let's look at John 17 and verse 15, where he says, "I do not pray that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the wicked one." Now, this is what is typically known as Yeshua's high priestly prayer, where Yeshua asks not for removal from, but protection from evil, supporting the view that believers are present during trials. The Scripture doesn't have this theme of being removed. Let's look at Acts 14 and verse 22. Where we read, "Strengthening the disciples by encouraging them to continue in the faith and by telling them it is necessary to pass through many troubles on our way into the kingdom of Elohim." Now this verse, it encourages perseverance, stating entry into the kingdom essentially requires tribulations or pressures, if you will, refuting the idea of escape as proponents of a pre-tribulation rapture suggest. So in conclusion, friend, as we've journeyed through the Scriptures, from the prophetic visions of the Hebrew writings to the revelations in the apostolic text, we've seen how historic premillennialism faithfully upholds Yahweh's unified redemptive plan. Unlike dispensationalism's artificial divisions, imposed timelines, and pre-tribulation escape, this view reveals one people of Yahweh, Jews and Gentiles, grafted together into Israel's olive tree, sharing in Abraham's promises and covenants through faith in Messiah Yeshua. The millennium, it emerges as a post-tribulation reign on a renewed earth where Satan is bound. Set-apart believers from all nations rule as priests under Yahweh's sovereignty, and creation flourishes in harmony, fulfilling Isaiah's new heavens and earth for all set-apart believers obedient to his Torah. Now, we've examined the post-tribulation timing of the resurrection and gathering at the last trumpet. This holistic interpretation, you could say, of prophecy, balancing literal and symbolic elements, and the clear refutation of a secret rapture, affirming instead endurance through trials, protected by the sovereignty of Yahweh and his faithfulness as we call upon his name. Rooted in the early assembly's teachings and tested against the full counsel of Scripture, historic premillennialism, it triumphs as the biblically grounded path, calling us to perseverance and faithfulness, to guard against deception, and live out Yahweh's commandments in anticipation of Messiah's visible return and the ultimate defeat of evil, specifically Satan himself. And so this concludes our series on the delusion of dispensationalism. And I pray that you will take the time to seriously consider what has been presented in these teachings with an open mind and an open heart. And perhaps more importantly, an open Bible. Seriously consider what the Scriptures teach concerning this topic. Friend, be a Berean and search the Scriptures, testing the doctrines you're being exposed to and the teachings that you're sitting under. Don't just accept what you're being fed from the mainstream church. Be a Berean. So as we close this video, I just want to thank you for joining us for today's teaching. And we hope that you'll continue to join us here at the Berean Way in our pursuit for biblical truth and understanding of the Scriptures. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the videos, share the content, and hit that bell icon so that you'll be notified of future videos. And I'd also like to encourage you to connect with us on the various social media platforms that we're on. And as we've shown in this video, and we're going to link them in the description box as well. And you can always reach out to us via the email associated with the channel, the Berean Way 1711 @gmail.com. And I'd like to encourage you, check back with us regularly, as our goal is here at the Berean Way is to release weekly content and full-length teachings in series, as well as maybe some shorter-length videos and clips, and possibly even some live videos in the future. And so we look forward to seeing you at our next video release. And until then, be a Berean, walk in the Berean way, and may Yahweh's shalom find you in your pursuit of biblical truth.